שיוויתי השם ונגדי תמיד, 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 לנגדי תמיד. שיוויתי השם ונגדי תמיד.
Shalom, and welcome to Spirit of the Torah. This is our episode on Parshat Vayishlach. Parsha begins with Jacob, Yaakov, on his way back home, sending messengers, angels, to greet his brother, Esau, to say, I'm coming home. I've been away, and I'm coming back. Now, the last time the two saw each other, Esau wanted to kill Yaakov. So Yaakov has every reason to be a little nervous, a little concerned about how this encounter may go. Now, how the whole story of Jacob and Esau is understood throughout our tradition is actually incredibly fascinating, because it really can be read in many different ways. Jacob can be seen as the deceiver who tricks and steals and deserves anything bad that comes to him, therefore, and Esau can be understood as the victim. And then on the other hand, Esau can be understood as undeserving and unworthy of the birthright that he callously, easily gives away or sells to Jacob, and therefore also unworthy of any blessings. And he can be understood as somebody of very poor character. Now, in the mystical tradition, it gets even more fascinating and even more polarized. Esau is sometimes understood and identified with the evil urge and the demonic forces, which in the Zohar, for example, these are the forces that make our lives so hard, or you might say interesting, so challenging. These are the forces which we are, depending on what language you want to use and how you want to understand it, these are the forces that we are fighting against, or you might say integrating. And what's really fascinating to see is the development that happens between, say, the Kabbalah of the Zohar, which emerged into the world in the 13th century, to see the development between that and Chassidut, the movement of Chasidic Judaism, started by the Ba'al Shem Tov, who was born in the year 1700, give or take a couple of years. It's a bit mysterious, we don't know exactly when. But Hasidism, as we know it, really became a movement starting from the year, say, roughly 1760 or 1772, depending on how you want to count exactly. And it very, very quickly affected a very large number of people. And part of the reason for its success across Jewish populations of Eastern Europe was its very refreshing and quite novel optimism. At its very foundation, they had taken a lot of the key ideas of Kabbalah, but they had reinterpreted them in a certain way, which was incredibly optimistic. And this is a great example. Whereas in the Zohar and classical Kabbalah in general, that other side, that demonic, that evil which is identified with our evil inclination, our Yetzer Hara, or you might say our destructive tendencies, that was primarily to be fought against. In Chassidut, we see many, many teachings which talk about integrating what there is that is good in that into our core. We very often see the language of including it within us. So the theological dualism, the moral dualism of the earlier Kabbalah seems to have given way to a more monistic or holistic approach. They really recognize everything really is one, and everything comes from a loving source, the infinite one, the Ein Sof. The Kabbalists and the Chasidim believe is good. And I think what's new here is that the Chasidim are very convinced, in a way that some earlier Kabbalists have been, but not all, that the divine is completely immanent, in the sense of being completely present in everything that we experience here in this world. And therefore, if something is challenging, then it's a challenge to work with and ultimately integrate in some way to find the hidden spark of divinity within it, rather than seeking to exclude or reject or suppress it. No, Chassidut, especially early Chassidut, the Ba'al Shem Tov and his early students, definitely emphasizes this inclusivity and integration. So we have a great example here with Jacob and Esau, because as I mentioned before, how this story is interpreted through the generations of our tradition is such an interesting window into the theology of good and evil. Esau depicted as the demonic, and then later as something that we can actually healthily integrate. And also Jacob can be understood in different ways, depending on who's looking and when. The approach of the Ba'al Shem Tov and his students in many early teachings is to say each individual person and the world in general is divided into matter and form, or substance and form. So in Hebrew, that's chomer and surah. The chomer is the physicality, the materiality that makes up our bodies and the physical material elements of everything that exists. And then we have our tzura, our form, which corresponds to our spiritual side, our consciousness, that which is truly unbounded and infinite. So this split goes back to the early Greek philosophers, and it's understood differently by different Greeks and different schools of Greek philosophy, and also by different schools of rabbis and Kabbalists. And for the Chasidim, for the Ba'al Shem Tov and his students, they use this split between matter and form to say everyone has within them those elements which are base, which are lowly, which are responding to our physical impulses and needs. And everyone has within us another side, which is striving for growth and elevation and spirituality and consciousness and so on. But what's really fascinating is what the teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov and his students do with this idea, specifically in the context of Jacob and Esau. Because here we have two brothers, two twins. We are descended only from Jacob, and Esau, as I mentioned before, often depicted as demonic evil, that which is excluded and to be fought against and so on. But what the Ba'al Shem Tov says is actually, everyone has both of these elements within them, and so does every generation present in the world at any moment. And our job is not to fight against, to exclude, to alienate, to conquer, to suppress that which is different to us or that which we think is less good, but actually to integrate. And he talks about how in the Talmud, in the Tractate of Arachin, there is a debate about the relationship between leaders and the rest of the generation. Basically, the rabbis argue over, do the leaders follow the generation or do the generation follow the leaders? There are rabbis who believe one way and also rabbis who believe the other. So the leaders and the generation both affect each other, it's reasonable to say from this argument. And the Ba'al Shem Tov says, just so with the body and the soul, or this, what we call lower or physical or material part of us, and our infinite consciousness, our spirituality, our soul, etc. They affect each other, which means we have a responsibility to take care of them both. Because if, God forbid, somebody takes the approach of, oh, my body is bad or lower or less important in some way and I'm going to neglect it, the Ba'al Shem Tov is saying, if you neglect your body, it's going to affect your soul too. In other words, really the distinction between them is not something that we should let govern our decisions so much. We should respect instead the unity between them and the fact that we are a holistic system of both body and soul, and we should work on them both together. And this whole idea has fascinating implications for our relationships with others too. Because again, back to Jacob and Esau, and the fact that Esau is so easy in the rabbinic tradition to see as this epitome of evil who we should be fighting against and ignoring, etc., especially given that he's often identified with Rome and Edom, forces which persecuted us terribly throughout the generations. However, to the Ba'al Shem Tov, he says that we learn from this relationship between Jacob and Esau that if you want to rebuke someone, again, this is something from the Talmud in Arachin, if you want to rebuke someone successfully, you have to include yourself with them. It is not possible to successfully change somebody's behavior, he says, by just telling them self-righteously how to change, unless you yourself, he says, make teshuvah, that is, make an act of fixing and returning what is inside you in a way that then has a spiritual effect on them, maybe unconsciously, maybe without them realizing it. Basically, he says, if you want someone else to change, you have to do the work. You have to do the inner work that this situation is calling forth from you. And then, he says, again, maybe unconsciously, spiritually awakens the possibility, the potential for other people that you are connected to, and he says we're all connected to each other, to make their own act of fixing, of returning, of teshuvah. And so basically he's saying, if we want to affect others, we want others to improve, we can't be taking the approach of fighting against them or shouting at them or condescending to them or rebuking them as if we know what is right and they are wrong. We have to include ourselves. In fact, in some of his teachings, he says, lovingly with them, because otherwise it's just not going to work. So this whole duality of Jacob and Esau, Jacob the good, Esau the bad, and this whole duality between our good inclination and bad inclination, and between our body and our soul, etc., so easy to look at the world in this bifurcated way, especially right now when our societies, many of them are so incredibly polarized. But this message from the Ba'al Shem Tov is so important and so needed and so radical, because it's reminding us over and over again in different ways how interconnected we are, and how if we really want anything to change, we really do have to start from ourselves and build out from there. So here's a practice for this week, and it's to notice some of the things that we would like to be different in our world. I'm sure we all can think of many such things. I have no problem at all coming out with a very long list. But here's the challenging part of the practice: to notice what is the inner work that I can do on myself related to this. It might be quite subtle, and it might be that the effects are really not visible by anyone else, or indeed, we may not even see outwardly the effects. The Ba'al Shem Tov is telling us to trust the practice. Trust the practice of being honest with ourselves. Trust the practice of trying to let divine compassion, Yud Hey Vav Hey, the name of compassion, come through us, and for us to be a vessel for that. May we merit to do the work that we are each here to do, each fix our little bit of the world, and as the Ba'al Shem Tov also says, to fix our little bit of the Messiah, of the vision of the perfect redeemed world of universal peace and justice that we are directed towards, that our tradition directs us to hope for, to see and to yearn for. And may we each fix our own little tiny bit and merit to put all those pieces together and make a better world. May it be so. Shabbat Shalom.